you're listening to this podcast, you're listening to a person try and be as honest as possible with you. It may not always be pleasant. It may not be easy, but it will be as honest as I can be.
Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Genuine Chit-Chat, the show where I have tangent-filled conversations with different guests each week to talk about their passions and what excites them, all in my personal quest to have the most interesting conversation possible. And this week's passionate person is none other than Seth Singleton. He's a podcaster, and he's been podcasting almost as long as I have with Storytelling with Seth. He's a published author. He collaborates with people such as Tony Farina, who obviously we are very fond of on this show. He's in Comics Lit, which is actually behind me, and I did a whole podcast on that. He's Anachronistic Comics. He's also got loads of other cool things that are coming out in bits and pieces, does comic book signings. He is an avid writer in every sense of the word. So we've been in the sphere together for quite a while, obviously being friends of Tony and connected to the Comics Lit gang and also the Comics Emotion sort of extended family as well. This has been a long time coming. So Seth, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really, really appreciate it.
Mike, thank you for having me. It is my genuine pleasure to join you and to be part of this. And I know that when it comes to Comics in Motion and in our Discord platform, I'm a periphery. I'm there. You'll see me, but I'm also one of those people who is comfortably conquering their anxieties at times. And so gradually, I'd like to believe you will see me participate more. I just have to get past one or two of those hurdles or silence the voices long enough to just, be a part of it. Because otherwise, you all seem so wonderfully intelligent that I sit back and go, no, I'm not ready yet. No, not yet. Not today. Maybe tomorrow. So thank you so much for having me on. It's a treat, really.
It's honestly a pleasure. Glad. I mean, no stress at all. It's funny with the podcasting sphere because where podcasting has certain degrees of pressures, but not the same pressures as other elements of normal life, is I find that in the nerd space, there's a big mix of introverts and extroverts. And I think in Comics in Motion, a lot of the individuals I meet, people like Tony is an out-and-out introvert, and he says it. He calls himself a hermit, whereas all of my interaction with Tony is when he's fully comfortable and is talking about something he's passionate about. So when Tony says things like he's an introvert, it's like, oh, for me, he's an extrovert. But then I'm like an extrovert to a T. Like all my best friends, for the most part, are basically introverts. But with me, they're quite talkative, in a comfortable space. So there's no pressure at all. I know not everyone is like my friends describe me as like a Labrador puppy. So when I meet a new person, I'm like, oh my God, hello, who are you? What's your best thing? And most people are like, oh, this person's taking interest in me. That's fine. And some people are like, this is a bit much. So I've learnt over the years to sort of taper myself down a little bit. But I do want to talk about a lot of the different creative things you've got going on. But I thought there's a couple of things I've noticed that you've mentioned, both in Storytelling with Seth, back in the very first episode, which I did go back and listen to, as well as the Q&A one. And I wanted to ask you a little bit about some of the creative writing exercises and things you like to do. And I listened to something which I think it was in the Q&A sort of episode you did with yourself a little while ago on Storytelling with Seth. And it was the story of your creative writing exercise that got brought on by a substitute teacher. And you felt kind of seen for the first time, it seemed, by your peers at least. And so this is going to be a multifaceted almost question. And so answer it however much you desire. And it's kind of cutting deep immediately, but I thought it'd be a really great way for people to kind of understand you a bit and for you to really show yourself and get off that veneer. I want people to be comfortable here as much as they can. But I want to ask, do you currently feel less invisible? And I noticed with your podcasting that you are very self-critical and you're very aware of your own desire for perfection in a way. I think in the audio sphere, you're very critical and you want it to be of a certain standard, which is very admirable. A lot of us do strive for that. But do you find that getting in the way is a term you've used to describe yourself a little bit when it comes to the podcasting space? So do you feel less invisible? And off of that, have you found that you're coming out of the invisibility in a way is one of the reasons why you're specifically trying to adhere to this level of perfection? Because of where you've got this anxiety, you're like, I want to be out of the box when everything that I can at least somewhat control of myself is adequate that I'm presenting to other people, if you see what I'm saying.
I do see what you're saying, and I appreciate you diving in with something that I know might seem what are you doing? Don't do that. Don't do that. Right. And that would be almost the response many might feel like, one, how do you know this person is ready to answer this kind of question and address these things that they might admit to in a podcast, which for some people might be like a diary or journal, and for others, it's just like a confessional. I do feel less invisible. And along that path, I've also had to address the fact that there was a part of me that wanted to stay invisible because of how I felt about myself. And through wonderful conversations with a therapist who I am grateful for and I admire, I've focused on the idea that I have not liked myself at many different times in my life. And the more that I'm seen by others, I have to address that question. The more I step out to be seen. And one of the challenges I've struggled with is failure. I understand the cost of failure as it relates to myself personally, emotionally, intellectually. Um, I had to adjust at the age of 17 when I tore my ACL, and my body, in my opinion, failed me. And I also judged myself critically because I could have done something, in my opinion. And that's the challenge, I believe, also that comes with loving heroic figures that we enjoy in comics. They always find the way to rise above. And I want to do the same. I grew up actually in a religion that says all things are possible through faith. And yet I couldn't pray away my injury. I couldn't, solve questions about faith through faith alone. I was told, well, you're thinking too much about it. You're overthinking it. You're not just accepting it. I didn't want to accept. I wanted to know. That is something that I've also come to realize is part of what my struggle is when it comes to the work that I want to do, the fear that I have over the failures I've experienced, and the very clear understanding that it has happened again. It will happen again. I don't want it to happen again. I had this, my father was this, he's one of those titans, you look up at certain people and you say to yourself, that's a standard I can only hope to strive towards, right? I will never match. This was a guy who worked 40 hours a week, took every overtime shift after offered, came home, cooked dinner, cleaned, did so much, could work with his hands, change the oil, build shell. And you just sort of go, oh, how am I ever? I know nothing. I don't have his aptitude. I don't have his understanding. Right. So first it was about who am I measuring myself against? And then as I became and have learned to accept what being visible is like, I've also had to come to grips with the fact that sometimes I didn't handle my dislike of myself well. I judged myself when I did things wrong. I judged myself on things that were out of my control. And I addressed it, unfortunately, through some really inappropriate ways. I learned the value of pain medication after my first knee surgery. I learned to amplify it with alcohol. I had access through friends. I learned to drink to solve my problems because all of the figures that I enjoyed who suffered tragedy drank their way. I sought all of the ways to solve my problems without addressing the root of them, which was who I am and how I see myself and how critically I hold myself. And I think a year or two ago, perfectionism would have been something I would have said, no, I'm the opposite. I'm such, look at all these examples where I'm imperfect and I'm so conscious of my imperfections. But I also feel that in the process of talking about it, my hope, there's going to be a noise. My hope is that by being honest about it, by talking about it as frequently as I can, that I can prevent it from welling up inside of me, living inside of me, breeding, festering in the way that things like that do. And that the more that I am willing to say, I know this is happening and I'm fully aware that it's happening and I don't want to deny it. I don't want to make it bigger than it is. I don't want pity. I don't want any of those things that go with it. But I don't want to say this isn't happening. if I ignore it, it's not happening. I want to say, I'm aware that this is happening. I'm aware it's part of my process. I'm also aware that anyone else who's listening could experience varying degrees of this, as I have been so grateful when I listen to someone that I admire, someone who's um, achieved things that I feel are examples or exemplary of their craft, of their artistry, of their ability to communicate across a wide audience, and say, okay, they can talk about it. Maybe it's the talking about it that's part of it. Maybe I don't know. But I know that the running from it and the hiding from it is not helping me. It's actually led to destructive behavior in the past. It's behavior I've addressed. It's behavior I'm always addressing. And it's something that I interestingly found myself returning to with an idea that was so present when I first stopped drinking, which was the day by day. And also, I remember now that when I was a child growing up, it was so interesting because it's not like I was drunk as a kid, but there was a serenity prayer hanging on the wall. My family was very religious. And I remember that, the serenity prayer, the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, the wisdom to know the difference, and that idea of that wisdom. But that also, that this is something that podcasting allowed me to do in public in a way that I knew would only be affected by talking out loud. And at the time, I didn't have a therapist. On the few occasions where I've been in a group setting, especially when I went through some classes to get my license back, part of the thing was you had to attend different classes and talk about things. So I remember I told him, I was like, I can't afford a therapy right now, but guess what? If I'm in this group and I'm required to talk, you're going to get everything. I am going to vent in here, and you're going to get a lot of my ugly, and I don't care because I don't want to be here, but I'm paying for it. And so there are many facets to who I am, I know as well, but I want to be as honest about those things when they are so prevalent, and that to not do so, I feel would be a disservice. And also remove the connection that anyone else who experiences similar in whatever degrees they do would say, oh my God, there's someone out there saying something that I can relate to, that I've experienced. And if they're willing to take these kinds of risks, maybe I can too. It's part of what goes back to writing. I'm a big fan of this sci-fi series from the 90s called Farscape, which some people know and love and not everyone does. But I remember chuckling at how the spirit of writing in media could connect with me as I was growing older. I still love Buffy the Vampire Slayer when Angel turns, and the Joss Whedon monologue for Angel, where he's talking about if we weren't so human, if we weren't so flawed, if we didn't have, right, and power behind that. But also this idea from the show Farscape, where the character's talking about being in this other dimension, this whole other existence. And he says, look upward and witness the wonders I've seen. Right. And I always love that concept because within writing, within storytelling, within craft, I have read and felt things from stories that have moved me, that have shown me the world. And it seems so selfish to keep all that to me. And I want to show that to others the same way that a great professor said to me, your responsibility as a writer is to hear all the beautiful stories from the past. And instead of letting them die in those versions, to retell them to the next generation, because you're that bridge, you're that connection of language, of identity, of time and space that allows these things to be transported without feeling like, well, they're from a different world. No, tell them now in a different format. Use a Baz Luhrmann's Romeo and Juliet as an example, right? Make it feel here and now. And the story is as real and powerful and beautiful as it was for you and as it can be for others. So when it comes to tangential, fear not. I have no problem enjoying that sphere. But I do know that that critical side of me, that perfectionist side of me, is a part of me that has played a critical role. I'll say that in much of my success and as much of my failure. But if I can accept and love that part of myself for what it is, for who it is, as much as I'm asking myself to love all of me, then I'm facing the struggle head on, and I'm willing to be vulnerable. I'm willing to take those risks. And I also want to say I am not covered by a veneer. If you're listening to this podcast, you're listening to a person trying to be as honest as possible with you. It may not always be pleasant. It may not be easy, but it will be as honest as I can be. Yeah. I think I'm going to pause there with that as my response for a moment. So,
no, I appreciate that. No, I appreciate the honesty that, normally I wouldn't ask such a deep cutting question. It's only because you, in your own podcast, have specifically put a spotlight on it. And when you've spoken about your writings on other people's podcasts and shows and things, you've again mentioned it, sometimes just in passing or other times, putting a spotlight on it. So it was something which I feel like I may have noticed anyway, but I probably would have saved it towards the end of the conversation and kind of warmed up to it. But I thought, you know what, because you've been so upfront and so honest about these things, I really want to share that to other people. And apologies to the listeners if I sound disheveled or look disheveled, because I am. I'm a little bit ill and bunged up, and I'm currently a mouth breather, so I'm going to have to do a lot of editing to edit out my breath in Seth's amazing sort of open self-evaluation there. So, I really appreciate that. There's a couple of things I want to touch on, which is, I myself have found that when my dad passed away 11 or nearly 12 years ago, and I found that I thought, I was fine. Don't worry. At the time, I was like, I'm taking this quite well, and a lot of people kept telling me I was taking it well, but actually I was, using a lot of substances on the weekends, and, I describe it as partying very, very hard. I wasn't doing it in the week, but on the weekend, it was very hard, very sleepless nights. And so I was self-medicating for a while, and I thought I'm fine. And it's like, well, really, I was just not addressing a lot of these other issues. But funnily enough, this evening, I've watched half of the documentary called Superman, the Christopher Reeve story, because 20th Century Geek, Scott Weatherly, shout out, he's currently doing a Superman retrospective, and he very kindly had me on the first two, for Superman 78 and Superman 2, and then I this week watched Superman 3 and 4, which were not as enjoyable, but I am watching the documentary. I watched half of it before this pod, basically with dinner. I'm going to watch the other half the other day, but another day. But Christopher Reeve, he says about when he went through his early days and him being an actor, he was trying to impress his dad, and he was always trying to do these things for his dad. He was trying to be perfect, to try and make this person didn't really care about him. I'm not saying this about your dad, but like his dad didn't really care about him. In that respect, he had lots of other families, very complicated stuff, but he was always trying his best, not for himself, but to try and get this person who didn't really care about them to really appreciate them. And then he said sort of after his accident, it really made him reevaluate his own life and reevaluate what is perfection and reevaluate like his own journey in life. And I just found that it's quite interesting of some of the things you said there connect to a degree with a man who is, very incredible in a lot of ways, but had this horrible accident and then had like a shift in his life. And I think that people have moments in their life, I think the term is anchor points. And, I know my dad passing away, I've described it as it's the worst thing that's ever happened to me, but it's the best thing that's ever happened to my character, to me as a person, for my growth. And by the sounds of things, without delving too deep into some of the personal struggles that you had in extreme detail, is that the things that you went through, the trials you went through, you've come out the other side and you've really learned from them and you're using them to grow. And although I'm not a religious individual, I think that is also a lesson that a lot of religious texts also tell. So I think it's very important, and it is, in all honesty, it is brave to be able to be so open about those things in a public forum. So I do very much appreciate your openness and honesty there.
Thank you. That's something I'm trying to get better at hearing. And I'd like to point out my parents loved me immensely growing up. It was never a question of that. It was that I judged myself because I had a lot of expectation placed on me by myself, but also by what I heard about me. So it doesn't help that my name is Seth, which in certain translations means chosen, or that it was suggested by someone that I was, pivotal in reconciliation among a family that I was still growing up to figure out who they were, different elements like that. Not only that, but in the religion that I grew up in, which was Pentecostal, this idea of, essentially it's all of our responsibilities to go out and save the world by saving others from eternal damnation. And none of that stuff. And in all ways, I saw moments in my life where I failed. A friend committed suicide when I was 16, 17. He wasn't a close friend. I knew him at school, but he grew up in a faith, Mormonism, that was very difficult. And when he passed, his note said, I can never live up to what I should be. I'll never succeed as I am. I'm a failure to myself, my religion, my family. And it was like, man, that guy said a lot of things that I feel like, how close, and that can, so unfortunately, I could probably go through quite a unpleasant laundry list of moments like that have caused me to face and challenging and question. But I've also found such beauty in the challenge and the question, walking away from the faith that I grew up in, exploring religions of the world, finding harmony with ideas in Taoism, Kundalini yoga, asking, being willing to be afraid and embarrassed and awkward, but also discovering because of that, things that I would have never known, and that helped me to at least say, I know. I don't have to choose because I know. It's not like knowledge requires, oh, well, now that you know about this, you have to go in. It's not esoteric. It's not like I'm joining the Masons or something, where, hey, once you find out secret knowledge, that's it, buddy. It's blood in, blood out. But I did realize that I could grow from where I was, and that if I could find footholds with that, it was interesting how, even without being aware of it, I was addressing my insecurities, my self-doubts, and building this ability within myself to at some point do that great thing that I ask students to do, and my therapist has pointed out to me, which is to challenge myself with evidence. And if I can challenge myself with the evidence, and my claims, my voices, my thoughts, my doubts are essentially unfounded, cannot be supported by facts and evidence, and I can use evidence to build, then I can post an argument that I can stand on. And more often than not, that's been my footing when facing those things. But I do agree with that idea that, there's who we want to measure up to. I mean, and unfortunately, as artists and writers and creators, we have an unrequited love with the past, with the greats who came before us, because in some way we're all writing to that person who showed us the beauty of writing, and we all want them to say, oh, look, I see you learned what I told you, and you're carrying on. Well done, good and faithful servant. Congratulations on taking the baton and being the next. We're not all going to be that. We all want to. We're all going to strive toward it. We will not all reach it, but there's joy in the journey. There is courage in the pursuit. There is merit and valor in the willingness to take the steps. And there is, if you seek it, if I listen for it, if others who face the same challenges are willing and open, there is a place within that is content. I was really a big fan after I tore my knee and tried to pursue soccer, football for far too long, and then thought I can still be an athlete in other ways. I did a bit of boxing and loved it, enjoyed it. That's where Language of Fists came from. But also it was a chance to experience a whole other way of using my body, of testing my ability. And in that, I also found wondrous beauty. There is a magic to jumping the rope. And at first you might think it's the meditative sound of the thump, thump, thump against the ground and the feet. But there's another moment where if you're playing with the rope, you can flip it around where it's rotating around you like a sphere, like that beautiful moment in Superman 1, right? Where he's trapped and you've got this thing going around him, creating like an infinity loop that's trapping him. Well, you're suspended in that while the rope spins around you. And if the rope doesn't hit the ground and it's just your feet, there's a moment where you're in the air and the rope is circled around. If I'm going to be a romantic, if I'm going to be a poet, if I'm going to enjoy the beauty of writing as I've seen it and felt it and I want to express it, well, in that moment, not only am I weightless, but I'm hovering, floating. I'm suspended between earth and sky, and I'm encircled. I'm enjoy whatever poetic analogies that takes you to, whatever metaphors that inspires, whatever desires that might instill. But if there's beauty in so many places like that, right? And it's a shame not to share them, to tell them, to talk about them. So
yeah,
when I'm writing, I'm hoping that those are the things I get to do too.
Well, that's it. I mean, that's the perfect segue into your creative writing. So I was introduced to your writing through Comics Lit, which, I've done podcasts on that, and hopefully I'll be a future contributor as well. But I'm good friends with Tony and Tony, the masterminds behind it. So obviously your story is, or your essay rather, is about Constantine and Bacchus.
Yes.
So it's Myths and Vines. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the extended title, and then also what really was the concept? What was the starting point? Had you had a kind of idea for this already written before speaking to Tony and Tonya? Did you approach them? How did the kind of the creation and the publication of this story come from yourself?
I'd actually been exploring the idea with our friend Kelly, who used to be Kelly Gaines and is now changed to her married name, which is, I knew this yesterday. I was like, at some point I might mention Kelly. I hope I remember her married name, of which I can't right now. So I've not accomplished that goal I'd set for myself. But we had talked about this wonderful idea, and it was a project that it still has bones, but it was the idea of us both growing up in a religious environment and where we saw connections between religion and DC Comics. And that had already been sort of cooking, but events transpired. It wasn't something we were able to continue with at the moment, at the time. So when Tony mentioned this project idea, I thought, wow, interesting. What a way to take this one idea that we had been working with, but show me in a different light. And then in the process, I thought, I wonder what I would want to talk about. Well, I have always been a big fan of Dionysus. When I drank, I loved who Dionysus was. Even when I stopped, I enjoyed this existence, this idea behind being someone that isn't wanted by his dad, is cast off, grows on the beach with these playful nymphs, and has this sort of wonderful experience because of that, so free from all the other expectations that might be on a firstborn or the youngest or whatever hierarchical existence you might see yourself in. And then the freedom to pursue the things that were important. This love of vines, this recognition of the elixir that they produce, but also how it became so valuable to others that soon eventually people were saying, oh yeah, no, Dionysus is from here. He's not really from there. He's from here. And the way that the vines carried his myth with him. So as I thought about that idea, I was like, wow, that's so great. You know what's fun about that? He's kind of magical. And when you think about magic and you think about vines, think about Constantine. Here's the thing about Constantine. And then it just started to snowball. And as I did some research, I was captivated by the idea that what I felt was my root thesis was that what connects these two characters is they are born of the creative imagination. Homer said, I didn't come up with this. I'm blind. The muses came. They spoke in my ears. The fates, everyone. I'm being told these stories. I'm just a listener, right? Which is what sort of, it makes so many great stories where the writer is telling the story, because they're the fly on the wall. They're that, why are you here? What's your importance? What's your value? The writer, right? But he's the one who lives and tells the story. He's the one who gets to hey, I'm the reason you have immortality. Get a load of that. The power of creation. And taking that and then reading a bit more about Alan Moore, you read the Wizard article where he's giving an interview and he's saying, yeah, so the artist came to me and said, we'd like to do a Sting inspired character. And then as we realized, okay, we're going to take these other elements, but we're going to create something more. We're going to add the trench coat. We're going to do something different with his style of dress and the smoking and give him a background. And then Alan Moore is sitting in a sandwich shop and he's like, Constantine walks in, not Sting in a trench coat, John Constantine, trench coat, the look, all of it. He walks in, gives me a wink and walks out. Like at that moment, the envisioning, the creator, the imaginator, the person who did that, and through, yes, collaboration with the artist, which you can say the same was said of Homer, but there is this thread between two storytellers creating characters who take on a life of their own. And in my thinking, Alan Moore is someone who has a very strong grasp of storytelling across a wide array.
Agreed.
It's kind of like when I hear the argument about whether or not Shakespeare can be real. And according to a couple of my professors, they were like, he had the classical education. These ideas that he wrote from were grounded. I mean, they were drilled into him. The schools then were not kind, but also the information never left you. It was literally probably beaten into you. So this idea of, how it's possible. Well, given who Alan Moore is, I can definitely see him inspired by classic myth, of also the idea of similarities between themes that have been important to stories since that time, right? The connections between Bacchus and Constantine, both unwanted by their fathers, both tragic passings of their mothers, both not fans of their version of the devil. Dionysus had no problem saying, if my mom is stuck in Hades and I don't think that's right, I'm going to go there. I'm going to pull a trick on Hades. I'm going to take her from the underworld. And at the same way, Constantine, as I discovered, has no problem saying, yeah, I'll let you think you're mocking me over the death of my friend, but I have no problem tricking you into drinking booze that's made from holy water and then watching you suffer as I beat on you for a little bit. Because guess what? I don't like you anyways. My friend's dead, and I'm going to process my anger this way. So I found those wonderful pieces, something that I said, okay, yeah. And I was also lucky that I had found a wonderful biography about Bacchus that also lined up so many things that I had already seen. So they gave me that evidence that I could say, look, I'm not just coming out of nowhere. Please take a look at the biographer, take a look at what's being said and why, and then also take my interpretation of that and also my understanding of what Moore said. So that's how I chose to weave that together. It started with an idea, and I just kept listening and following it. And as I did, the threads were there, and I just said, okay, I think I can weave this together. And that was what I believed I did when I was done.
Yeah, I mean, I loved it personally. I thought it was incredible. I thought it was a really, really good essay. And, I'll put a link in the description to my full conversation with Tony and Tonya. We didn't get to break down everyone's essays. But funnily enough, we spoke quite a bit about Tony Holt's essay about Invisible Man and the Black Panther.
So and beautiful.
It was incredible. Well, that as well as Tonya's banned books conversation with Tony, as well as a couple of other individuals, inspired me to read Invisible Man, which is now my favorite book of all time. And I was just trying to find it. I have a copy of Invisible Man that I lent to someone. So I was trying to find the quote, but essentially what you were making me think of with the, because I know you've put it in your essay as well, is when Alan Moore, he kind of saw the personification of Constantine. When, in the introduction of the 30th anniversary edition of Invisible Man, I believe John F. Callahan is speaking about it, who's the executor of Ellison's estate. And he basically says that one of Ellison's quotes, and I can't find the exact wording, was in Ellison's book, Invisible Man, he mentions about some riots that happened in Harlem. And there's certain things that happen in the book that actually eventually happen. And people are like, how did you predict this happening? And he's like, the thing is with fiction is that fiction doesn't necessarily create reality, but it's almost like a vessel through it. And essentially he's like, eventually things are going to manifest themselves. And you as the writer just have to kind of take in your surroundings, put it to the page, and then it will just kind of happen. Things will just happen. And the way he put it was so brilliant, but I can't find the exact quote. And it made me think of what you were saying there, and obviously what's part of your essay. But also, so much of writing is about creation, as you said. And I think a lot of religious ideologies, a lot of that comes from the power of the creator. That's kind of a lot of, especially the Abrahamic religions, when you get outside of the Abrahamic religions and when you do get into more of the Eastern religions, when there's slightly more gods or there's a different perception on what God actually is, it gets slightly more complex. But with the Abrahamic religions, it is, God is the Alpha and the Omega. That's kind of the whole point, the creator and destroyer. And so, because my parents, neither of them are religious, but I went to a Catholic primary school. Religion is something that's always very much intrigued me. And so I wonder if part of, I'm not trying to psychoanalyze you here, but I wonder if part of your enjoyment of writing as well, with the element of creation, potentially comes from sort of that starting of your religious background, of the appreciation of that, of being told for so long. There are, I think, a lot of benefits to elements of religion. I myself am not religious, but I think a lot of it gets unraveled and, say, complicated by the imperfection of humans and their lack of being able to admit when they're wrong is a really, really, really easy way to kind of describe it. It's a lot more complicated than that. But I think the creation part is so important because whenever I speak to other creators, especially writers, and I know Tony's kind of said it, is that when he writes fiction, the characters speak to him. You know, people like Alan Moore, he's really a vessel. His mind and what he's created via, you know, be it either Swamp Thing or Miracle Man or V for Vendetta, any kind of those things. He's got like his imagination is almost an antenna to other areas of alternate realities, maybe future realities. Like he's got something that few others have. And I just think the power of creation through writing is something that a lot of people don't really understand unless they are, in air quotes, a writer. And I like to quote Tony here, which is, if you write, you're a writer. You don't have to be published if you just have the passion there. So like that drive for you, I wonder if you could delve a little bit more into the awakening. Like you don't have to repeat the story that people can find in storytelling from Seth, with Seth, but you know, the creating writing exercise with the substitute teacher that kind of made you feel found, almost from that cataclysm in your life, from there to sort of now, have you found that the creative process for you has really also been therapeutic in a lot of ways? Because even like with your description of, you know, Homer and Bacchus and dynasties, is that you have an idea or something in you is like a spark and you go, I need to pursue this in some way. And then you find that in the pursuit of that, because of the framing of you're going to write something, the pursuit of that thing, actually, the research of it or the writing of it, gives you something that you wouldn't have got if you hadn't had that desire to write, if you see what I mean. I wondered if you had any kind of words on that, on the kind of the desire of writing.
Yeah. So the desire of writing is interesting because for a long time, I forgot that I got in trouble when I was a little kid for telling stories. I grew up, I was born in Long Island, New York, which is on the other side of the country. And then really young, like 5, 6, we moved to California. And this has been my home since. But I remember getting in trouble riding the bus as like a kindergartner, I think, which is wild. The kindergartners rode the bus at such a young age. And I would get in trouble for telling stories. So I would get in trouble because I would tell stories where I was visited and I was taken up in a craft and seeing the world and saw all these magical things. And I don't know where any of this came from, but I also know that there's a funny story that my dad tells that he got up one morning, like scratchy throat, gets up, gets a glass of water. We had this really nice half-acre backyard. We lived in this really country area. And he looks out and there's a play set, swing set. And there I am with my leg wrapped around the chain, hanging upside down. And I'm just holding on. I'm frozen. Like I'm not even pulling. He thought that however long I'd been there, I just locked my hands around that thing and I knew that my leg would break, but I had to hold on. I don't know how I got out there. I don't know why I got out there. I know I love the swing set according to the story, but I also don't know the part of me that realized what was happening and knew to do that. So there were these moments that would happen that I couldn't explain. And also I would tell these stories that to me seemed fun that I would get in trouble for. So I stopped. But suddenly that 7th grade story, that moment when a teacher asked me to tell a story and I do, and I see everyone look at me. And I realized that the power that my parents and others were afraid of then was that stories I was telling was scaring the kids around me, or they were going home and telling others. And there was an idea suddenly for the parents that something was happening that was causing a reaction among their kids. And this was a reaction that was not welcome and needed to be stopped. I sequestered my ability to tell stories until that 7th grade substitute teacher. And from that moment, I started to understand this power that I'd held away. And also, I was trying to grow with it. But I also had to challenge those ideas about me. When it comes to the spirit of writing, of the idea behind it, I loved what you mentioned about how others experience it, because when Tony talks about the characters speaking to them, they don't do that with me as much. When Alan Moore talks about the antenna, it's not like that. For me, it's like if I allow myself to look up to a blank wall, or when I was called a space cadet by my mom, because I would tune out at the things going on around me because they were absolutely boring. I didn't want to be in church. School was boring. I didn't want to listen to this. I could do this, and already something's happening. There is something in my imagination. There's a video screen, and all I have to do is raise my head to there, or even while looking at someone, go, you might think I'm here, but behind my eyes, I'm watching something else entirely. And it was interesting that it was something that I was constantly told, oh, you got to control this because it's getting in the way. You're wandering thinking. Well, now when I want it, right, it's about reversing that control. So more often than not, when it comes to the stories, it's about what do I see and what do I feel when I see? And then when I notice the feeling of what I'm seeing and what's drawing me, if I'm willing to listen, that is what leads me forward. That willingness to say, did you see that? Okay, we're going to get from here to there. And I don't know how we're going to do it. I know there's some terrain but I'm not forgetting that. And when it's just from the imagination, like that's the part of writing, is to get from the vision to the place where the vision feels as real as I experienced it. And a lot of times what I'll tell my students, like, you have an idea, and what we want to do with each time you're writing is get closer and closer to that idea, right? There's a spirit, there's a feeling, there's a voice, there's an antenna message, something, and you want someone else to know, this is what it's like when I feel it. I want you to feel that same thing. So in many ways, it all goes back to that answer I was giving at the very beginning. I'm seeing something, and my imagination is telling me that there's a reason why it's showing me this. It wants me to see something. And just to go back to the idea about the invisible man for a minute, because I was intrigued, and I'm going to enjoy the tangent because you so encouraged me to. Writers are so used to seeing plots and narratives that everything is a plot and a narrative. Everyone is a character. We see how they fit in the spectrum. So it's not hard to see events and go, well, they're not going to like that. And then they're going to react. And pretty soon you're telling the story that if you wrote it down, it's very easy for it to transpire in the next 5 to 10 years or in the next 20 to 50. But the problems that things create and the events that transpire, I know that everyone in the podcast is big fans of Last of Us, and I've been rewatching a little bit, and also caught the first episode of season 1. And I noticed that moment where they're talking with the creator at the end, and he's like, everyone is experiencing what the consequences of violence are throughout all of these different. And when you understand storytelling in that way, everything about the world is. When you see someone new enter your group of friends, like I never forget the day that 2 of my friends, it's our senior year in high school, and my one friend is kind of breaking up with a girl, and my other friend has just met her. And I'm watching the 3 of them walk away. And it's one and one in the middle and one on the other side. And I was like, oh my God, that's going to destroy them. And not long later, one relationship ends, a new relationship starts, and a friendship is gone. And it doesn't take much. If you've read a few stories, this is commonplace. If you've read enough stories, then the world around you is one that you can see almost too clearly. And that also, I think, becomes the challenge, because how do you communicate what you see to others in a way that will require them to listen, especially if you're worried, if you're terrified, if the fears that keep you up at night are something you want to warn others about because you've read enough stories that you know what they can lead to. How do you trust your ability to be that person with the authority to tell those stories? How can you believe that you, out of all others, right? Look at poor Frodo. How many times did he say, I'm the wrong guy? And everyone said, and that's exactly why you're the right one, right? And it's the willingness to see that maybe at times we're the wrong person for the thing we think we are. But if we're willing to be who we are, who we feel the most true and close to, then we realize that rightness that we've always been, and that if we can accept that, whether it meets our expectations prior, or it meets our veneer, or it meets what we want to be seen as, but if that part of ourself is enough, if that is enough, right? that person can tell all of those stories, knowing that the person telling them is enough. And if that is enough, then the stories that are being told are enough. And the telling of the stories is enough. And then suddenly something that Tony Farina says, like, if you write, you're a writer. Well, guess what? If you're enough, then what you write is enough. You don't have to ask the question, because you've accepted you as being the totality of all you'll ever need, of all you, right? I could go further, but it's that idea of the closer you come to accepting, the stronger you can be in the authority and belief that what you are saying has value, because you've already seen, weighed, accepted the value of yourself. And now you're taking that and saying, these are where my stories come from, right? And this is why I believe my voice. And I believe that when you hear it, the authority behind it is something you can say, that's truth. Listen to it. I might not agree with it. It might not be who I am, but that story, their truth. And so often, I think when people say my truth, I think that's what they're really getting to. I've come to see this part of myself. I've accepted this self. I recognize this self, good and bad, flaws and all. And all of that is enough behind what I'm saying and what I want you to hear and hopefully believe. And just to continue as a writer, that I can pass that spark, and that someone out there is going, ooh, did you feel that? Man, other people should feel that too. And right then, I'm also lucky, and I'm going to say this with confidence. I know that there's so many teachers who say, if I could know I reached one student, it's all worth it. Way back when I was first starting as a sub, and I was coming home way too late, partying way too hard. And I run into a former student who's graduated and has like smoking a cigarette outside her car. And I'm really rough. And I'm just getting to like, okay, I'm going to head home, and flags me down like, hey, Mr. Singleton, so great to see you. And I'm like, so ashamed of what I've been like you're seeing me as this horrible drunk person. And she's like, man, but you taught me I could be something, and I could do something, and I could believe in this and that. It was like, wow, it's not when I want to hear it. And it's not when I want to engage in this conversation. But right there, if you can take that and know you had that impact, well, guess what? For the last 25 years, you've just been building on that. Maybe you were too ashamed to see it. Maybe you've been too insecure. Actually, I know you've been too ashamed. I know you've been too insecure. I know your anxieties and self-doubts. But when you do look back, when you ask questions and you see the evidence for what it is, not what some voice in your self is telling you, there's an amazing wealth that you have. And the evidence is there. Willingness to see it. That's the hard part. I'm caught up by something I heard recently where someone said, why don't I remember these beautiful things I did? And said, well, because we're trained to remember only our failures. It's part of our evolutionary ability to survive. Don't make that mistake and you won't die. Well, now we're translating into our experiences with other things, but we need to step back from the edge and realize that these failures are not life and death. They're actually growth and opportunity that our ancestors never had. And we, as these newest evolved versions, we get to do that. We get to go beyond what our evolutionary origins were. And we get to aspire, seek our potential, however close we come or not.
No, it's very insightful. And, it's funny because from the conversations it sounds like you now is almost talking to the version of yourself that gave the answers to my very first question right at the start, which is it's very interesting, and it links into actually furthering on some of the things you were just saying there, which is you have got it sounds like an odd tangent, but you have got a comic called Greedy Greg, which the people can check that out. It's on, I think it's Hapsie. I'll put a link in the description. I read a few of them, and it is really, when I read it, I was like, oh, cool, this is, teaching kids the right lessons, that kind of thing. But do you think, as well as it being that, it's also trying to inspire a younger audience as well? Because I know people we know of, people in the Comics Emotion family, some individuals found that they went off reading for a while and they got into comics. Or some people, like Math, he has been open and said that he has struggled in the past, or when he was younger, reading prose fiction. But because, and I think people with dyslexia have this as well, which is struggle reading page after page after page. But when you've got comics and when you've got visual elements to it, it can make that transition a bit easier. So I wondered if you're writing of Greedy Greg, not only is there the elements of, it's trying to teach a lesson, but also potentially trying to inspire kids to really see in themselves the kind of things which you have just really been saying, almost preparing them for that realization.
It's a goal. It's definitely on my horizon. It's one of those things that I know if I can navigate celestial navigation, to paraphrase one of my favorite West Wing episodes, if I use the celestial navigation and know that I'm going, then all of these areas are desirable to me. Where I end up, as long as that's the direction I'm heading and that's the horizon I'm aiming for, is probably going to be a new discovery of some kind. But it will be with that intention, and it will be that intention that ultimately determines my destination, right? Which sounds like it's leading to something lovely and going off in that lovely sort of literal sort of, oh, are we getting into rhyming? But what I'm thinking of at those moments, honestly, is that these stories, when we're telling them, and these moments that we're experiencing, are also hearkening to that childhood experience. So when I write Greedy Greg, I mentioned I got to write a Christmas one, and the first thing I thought of was Charlie Brown's Christmas Story, and how much I enjoyed what that did for me as a Christmas story. So with each one of these stories, what I'm thinking about is, how can I pass that spirit of magic I remember as a kid reading these stories, but also how can I talk about a world that is so vastly different from mine, and in which there are things going on that is so much more prevalent in their lives. But how can I tell it through a character who, and this is where I also look at history and connections. If you think about The Shadow, right? If you think about the creation there from Will Eisner, and then you realize that he did his Joe Dope comics for the U.S. government, where he had character. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Joe Dope, but his whole role for the U.S. government, this was during World War, right? So this was during World War II, and Eisner's like, look, I'm not going to shoot a gun. I can draw. And here's what I'm going to do. I'm create this comic where a character named Joe Dope does it all wrong. And so GIs would read that and go, oh, well, don't end up like Joe Dope. You better grease your ankles. You better do this and this. And so if I take those two ideas and say, one, how can I use what someone has done so masterfully through Joe Dope and through the spirit, and then take that same spirit and say, okay, translating for a new generation. Yes, how can I, one, tell you those values, but also two, how can I show you that in a way you're a little bit smarter than Greg? Hey, look, you kind of know what's going to happen. Hey, you can kind of see after a while that there's this, yes. And the more that understanding grows, yes, you can do this too in some way. It's also a place where I feel you can tell stories that, for kids, sometimes you can tell a story like the Lorax. Wow, that got heavy. But presented in the right medium, kids will take it, digest it, absorb it, and it'll stay with them. So how can I do that same thing with the Greedy Greg stories? And also that feeling that you're talking about. How can I translate my hopes into them carrying it with them and the beliefs that they can do?
Yeah, that's amazing. It makes me think, actually, there's a comic book in the UK called The Beano, which the character that worldwide people know about that is Dennis the Menace. But there's also a character in there called Roger the Dodger, and he is much about conning people a lot. And I remember reading The Beano as a kid. I read The Dandy as well, which is sort of very much connected to that. But The Beano, like a lot of what Dennis the Menace, I remember only really now looking back, teaching me is, in very, very, very layman's terms, if you're basically a dick to people, people aren't going to like you or trust you, and things won't work out in the end. And it's the same with Dennis the Menace, with Roger the Dodger. It's like, if you're always trying to be cunning and you're always trying to take shortcuts and you're always trying to like screw people over to get stuff off them that you don't really deserve, what ends up happening is you end up with less than you started. And it's all these lessons. There's so many ways where kids are so much more intelligent than people give them credit for, but also they're always looking for lessons to learn. And sometimes those lessons have to be quite obvious and quite forward, and other times those lessons have to be quite subtle. And I think it depends on not only the kid, but also the age and also the media of what exactly it is that they're trying to connect to. And you never know what's going to inspire them. And I think as well with my brothers who are quite a bit older than me and they've got kids, and like things that I remember from my childhood is that you never really know what's going to become a core memory for a child. You don't know if in anger you're going to say the wrong thing and then they're going to remember that for the rest of their life and it's going to forever form their personality. You don't know if they're just going to catch a glimpse of a TV show that you're watching and that does the same thing. You don't really know. So I think it's like one has to be conscious of what one is showing to kids, but also like there's so many things that can be so inspiring to them and in ways that one wouldn't expect. And that's kind of how I felt about Greedy Greg, is that, yeah, obviously the obvious the clear thing from the front is we're teaching kids not to do these bad things, in air quotes. But as you kind of were saying there, it's like the depth of what they can learn and the ripple effects from that is so important.
And it's as you pointed out, it's a question of what will resonate and when. And if you don't know, how many times can you try and demonstrate it? And I think the other key is that it's really easy for us to see something bad, quote, and go, oh, that's wrong. But then we see something that's a variation and we go, oh, well, that's different. Yes. Is it still bad? And that's really where we end up with a challenge. Because, well, now there's other factors involved. And how does that change how we're thinking about things? Or are we thinking about right and wrong as it relates? And so often with Greedy, what I love is that I get to look for ideas that sound great when you're talking about budding young eco warriors, which is what Hapsie is geared to. And yet at the same time, it's very easy for something that sounds great to go horribly wrong, or to, I think there's actually a project out. I saw a clip for it, and it's in which two women are promoting like homeopathic health approaches, and they go in two very different directions. Like one is trying to inform and the other is trying to deceive, right? And it's what are the consequences that come with that? And something new and from exotic materials or that uses language that we're not familiar with can be very disorienting. And the thing is, that's fun with Greedy Greg. You get to see him, because his perspective is greed, misinterpret, incorrectly respond. I mean, the one that I love to use with people that always seems to work so well is they're like, well, how do you explain that to kids? And I'm like, perfect one, carbon footprint. Greedy thinks charcoal is carbon, smash charcoal, put it into a footprint, spray paint it with sealing glue or something, pick it up, and you have a carbon footprint. What is the problem? It's carbon, it's a footprint. I sell these and I improve the environment. None of that makes any sense, but it's so easy for somebody to be like, oh, I'm doing a great thing. It's reducing carbon footprint. I'm buying them. No, you're not. You're buying some guys.
We're missing the nuance. I think that's the key of always growing up, is that, you get the goalposts of morality when you're younger. Very few people think, it's really simple of side, like killing is wrong in air quotes. Okay. That's quite a general thing most people adhere to. And then you go, and that's what you think when you're a kid. Killing is wrong. And that's that simple. And then as you get older, I'm not saying killing is right, but we could all probably think of examples where we'd go, actually, if this scenario happened, maybe not, or this scenario. And you go, okay, well, let's try something else. And you go, stealing is wrong. But then you go like the Les Miserables sort of idea, which is like, but what if you're stealing a loaf of bread from someone who's got 1,000 loaves of bread to feed a starving child? Okay, well, that's more complicated. And I think it's the younger generation, when they're really young, it's the goalposts of, air quotes, standard morality. And again, the term good and bad, I know I used the term first of bad, but it's like the term of good, bad, good, evil, etc. is so complicated because at the starting point of your life, it's quite simple. And then every year that you age, it becomes more and more nuanced. And I think that's really the key of aging, isn't it? Is really the nuance of situations. Relationships seem so simple when you're 8, but when you're 30, you're like, I don't think any relationships are simple, be it with just like my boss at work or a friend of mine, nuance is kind of the key of growth, I think, which is something that's complex, but I love that you are addressing that a lot in your works. But I do want to ask actually about Tragic Nerds, because Tragic Nerds is in Anachronistic Comics, Volume 1, and you've got Part 1 of Tragic Nerds, which is in there. So here we go, beautiful. I don't have the physical edition. I've got the digital, and I always buy physical. But the physical version was, at the time that I really wanted to read it, was a bit more expensive. So I was like, I'll go for the digital, go for the cheaper option. So I wonder if you could tell us just a little bit about what Tragic Nerds is, and maybe of what hints you want it to become, because it's only a part 1, and any sort of other connections with Anachronistic Comics as well.
So the first thing that I'm going to say is that I love this story because it gives me a chance to pay a moment of homage to our good friend, Mr. Steve J. Ray. I used to join the DC Comics news crew and do a weekly podcast. One day we're podcasting, and this is common when you've got a group. Somebody gets disconnected. You're passing the questions along. Hey, so-and-so, what do you think about that? Okay, it's, what's happening? And one of those events transpired. And I just said, hey, what if something happened? Guys, this is so great. We've got a story right here, right? It's a podcast and somebody goes missing. Now, we all sort of chuckled along, but I planted a seed and I couldn't really get away from it. So when the idea behind Anachronistic Comics was being discussed, and A.R. Farina, Tony, and Eric Lee, and I got to chatting a bit, that's where this idea sort of came about, where I thought to myself, okay, so we're talking about an anthology. There's a limited number of pages. Do I want to tell a complete story, or do I have an opportunity to do something that feels like it's a marriage of graphic novels and old radio serials? In fact, I've really enjoyed that HBO Max and a few others have recently started putting together these audio narratives, but you're like streaming them on your platform, but it's audio. And I actually met with some really nice folks on a couple of podcasts about doing audio dramas. So I started thinking about that and like, okay, how can I approach this from comic? How about if I take this idea of someone going missing during a podcast, right? And it seems like, oh, it's just a disconnection. But we give enough hints that no, it's more potentially than that. Certainly, it's ominous that everyone is located in a different city, potentially state, and yet one of them goes missing. And the event that caused them to all get disconnected affected all of them, despite how far spread out they are. So how could any of those threads really be about this person who's gone missing? And how is it that these nerds who basically run this podcast, which doesn't sound very impressive with a name like the Tragic Nerds, and probably this is like one of the few healthy outlets in their life while they're all pursuing these different things. And each one of the characters is trying to be something and they're not succeeding at it. And so this is like that one thing in their life that, like for so many of us, especially when you're creative, like I can struggle with writing, but if I do the dishes, I can look at a clean set of dishes and know I accomplished something. Writing, sometimes I can feel like I wrote something, but if it's good or not, does it suck? I don't know, right? I can't tell the value. And for these guys, they're determining the value of their lives based on the things they're pursuing, all of which are not giving them the answers they're looking for. The one thing kind of is this podcast, and now that's been disrupted because one of their members has gone missing. I'm looking at this a few ways. I want this to continue as a serial. However, when it comes to timing, what I might end up doing is collecting it. I'm in conversations with Eric Lee. And then also, I feel it has pieces for an audio drama that I've been putting together ideas around. So when it comes to Tragic Nerds, they're one of those, I feel this is one of those things where it's like, yeah, am I going to say IP and feel icky saying it? Or am I just going to say idea creation, whatever? I know that this is something that I want to keep telling the stories about. I'd like to keep telling them in comics. I hope I will. But I also see ways that I can tell this that would be very compelling in an audio drama approach and also in a collected version. So I'm doing a little bit of exploring with that. I'm also doing just some free writing around it. I've already written the next 3 or 4 chapters. I mean, like 2 through 4, maybe 2 through 5. And right now, Eric and Lee and I are talking about like, okay, let's see how far this gets before we have to kind of stop and just start making it into something. Or will it come to an ending that we can then say, okay, we know how this wraps up? Because right now it's in those 2 places. We can keep it going for a long time and kind of have some fun with it in different directions, or we can look at it as complete narrative and what kind of ending that would be.
Mm. Yeah, I was definitely intrigued by it. I very much, I felt when I saw it, I was like, oh, I've been there. I love podcasting. Obviously, I've been doing it for so blimmin' long, and I've done group podcasts. I often harken back to, with the late Steve J. Ray, is when Justice League, the Snyder Cut came out. And, it's a 4-hour film. Doesn't need to be that long. Probably not. But we had a big podcast on it. I think there were 5 of us. And I hosted it. It was on the Comics in Motion feed. I hosted it and then I edited it afterwards. And there was, the recording I think is almost 3 hours. I think the release version is 2.5 to 3, but I think we were on air for nearly 3 hours. And so editing that, because of slight audio lag, which meant all the audio things weren't synced up, people leave at certain points, and I remember going, it was amazing. I liked it. It got a lot of people listening and loads of people really enjoyed it, especially at that time, because, that was one of the biggest moments in nerd culture at that point. But when I read Tragic Nerds, I was like, this is hitting home. Is like the amount of times I've done podcasts with a couple of people, especially when they're your friends. Like if you do it with someone who's like quite like a bigger guest or something, someone who you don't really podcast with either often or it's just a one-off. You're on your best behavior. You're like, right, let's make sure everything is perfect, everything is professional, and then you just try and be on your best behavior. But when it's with a couple of mates, you can be a bit more loose. And I find that when that happens, it's great because you're all comfortable with each other, but also sometimes it can mean a bit of laxing. It's almost like if you have an event or something. I know that friends of mine who are like musicians or do other events and stuff, and then their friends show up, and it's like, great, my friend's here to support me, but also I'm trying to have this veneer of professionalism, and my friends know who I am behind this mask, and it's kind of like they know who I am as opposed to who I'm kind of trying to be. And I felt that. I was like, when the person is drinking their IPA or their like special beer, and then they smash it on the microphone and these kind of things. I was like, I've been there. I feel that very close to home. It very much is like a podcaster's comic, which I very much appreciated.
Wonderful. That also was the spirit I wanted to capture in a comic. It's an experience that until you've been in it, it's really hard to understand, especially the first few times. Like first couple of times I hopped on with the DC guys, I was constantly just like mute issues or clearing my throat or hearing myself and finding I'm repeating this word constantly that I would be like, yeah. And then I'd be like, why the fuck am I saying yeah so many goddamn times? Like, what is wrong with you? Do you have some sort of form of a condition that requires you to, what? So that inner editor that comes out so often, right, can put us at such ill ease. And that's when so often I find that when we're with someone who we look up to, someone who's in a higher tier as far as success or some other notability, that we're like, we have to, right? And more often than not, it bites us in the butt. But when we're relaxed with our friends, we're just kind of hanging out. Yeah, it's wonderful that you can enjoy all of that and you can feel this sort of camaraderie. But then there's the trick, which is that you care about those people. You develop friendships and bonds. You connect over these things. The interesting thing about the Tragic Nerds is they sort of connected through like a nerd chat thing. Their relationship is all online, even this podcast. But now if one of them goes missing, A, they have to care enough to do something about it. And then B, they have to be willing to sort of let down their veneer a little bit and be exposed in the process of looking for this person. And can they successfully navigate that
and push the boundaries
while also being these people who've clearly only wanted to interact with each other through this distance of separation, which is gradually being removed. And what happens to who they are as a group? What things did they find about each other that they don't like or that they like even more? And that's, of course, always the risk when we expose ourselves to others, when we are willing to let people in. The more public I've tried to become, just to go back to that idea again, right? The idea of becoming more public, being seen, but then can you live with how you're seen? Can you live with how others see you? Can you accept the version of you that conflicts with the version you've been trying so hard to get them to see? And what's the stories that we can gain from that and the things we can uncover? That's my hope.
100%. Yeah. I mean, it's like with friends, isn't it? When you're friends with someone, it's very different from when you live with them. I've lived with friends of mine and it's made us closer in a lot of ways, but it's also not made us distant in other ways. It's kind of like the dynamic just changes because when you're with them all the time, you're like, I thought I could spend 100% of my time with this friend. And then actually, no, they're a pain to live with because of this reason or that. And I think with the digital age is kind of the inverse, which is, when we podcast together, lots of people, Comics in Motion, I'm very friendly with, and I've met most of them in real life now. But like, it's almost meeting someone in a 3D space, isn't it? Because where we're interacting here, there's a barrier. There's no physical contact. I can only see the square you allow me to see, vice versa. But when you meet someone in real life, there's all the outside extraneous variables that come into contact. There's all the little things that they may not want you to see. There's so much. There's another layer of it. Almost if this is 2D, then in real life is 3D, or if this is 3D, real life is 4D. You know, it's that kind of extra depth. And I think from what you're hinting at is that it feels like the Tragic Nudge is kind of going to lead down that. So I'm very, very excited to hear about that. But as we do start to wrap up around this time, but I do want to ask about podcasting, which is a nice full circle. So, very simple question, but you can answer it as detailed or as simple as you would like. But what have you learned since you started podcasting just over 7 years ago?
I started with the idea at first because of addressing things like insecurity and value, right? Like, what authority did I have even doing this? Who was I to record my thoughts, and how could I have the audacity to imagine that anyone would want to listen to them, find value in them? And yet each person I met and what I found was a way to navigate that was to first talk about stories that interested me, but then to talk about people who were creating stories. And through meeting them, I saw this spirit of resilience, this unbelievable courage to step forward and say, what do I have to lose? Or as our friend Tony has pointed out more than one occasion, you miss 1,000% of the pitches you don't swing at. Like, the inability to move is the guarantee that nothing will happen, right? The willingness to move is to risk to fail, but also the only way you'll have any attempt at success. Their ability to do that, each person's story about how and the why, was a reminder for me that I'm going to have uncertainty. I'm going to have doubt. There will be times where I'm writing more and less, where I will believe in myself more and less. But the willingness to come back every day and say, no matter how much I wrote or didn't, if I wrote one word, if I thought about writing one word, if I researched about all the things I want to write about today and never wrote any of them down, as Tony said, right? You're still a writer. And that claim, that identity that you can hold on to no matter what's going on around you. It could be that I never publish another thing again, and the only job I ever have is stacking paper in a warehouse of paper, right? And that, like, it seems so like whatever futility, but I wrote before then, and any moment I can, I'll write after or during. And that identity, once you are willing to claim it, it's really hard to get rid of. You no longer ignore it. You own it and you embrace it. So through podcasting, what I've really loved is the people that I've met who reinforce, restate, follow that idea that I mentioned that professor of mine said, which is to do what they've seen others do and do it again. That it is almost like a reaffirmation every time I want to do something for me. By amplifying them, I found a way to give value to something that I eventually found value in for myself. And then because of that, I learned that we determine value of ourselves and all these things around us. And it's that understanding, which is more often than not going to be the determinant of who we are and the quality of the life that we live. If we can do that in a similar way, if we can say, again, this is enough, I am enough, everything about me is enough to do that, then even when it's hard, we'll still succeed. Even when it's less than we did yesterday, even when it feels like nothing compared to the scope of everything, well, it still counts. In fact, that value is something that we get to see and reevaluate and better understand. And it's, as you pointed out, the nuance that we gain through our growth is, it's step by step, it's hand in hand with the wisdom that we acquire because of the understanding that nuance reveals to us. So through podcasting, it's about that ability to build on that understanding and know that we process it, compress it into wisdom, and that what I gain from that is something I have that sort of responsibility, not only to continue doing it because I don't know what the next creator can say that someone else needs to hear, just like I don't know what I'm going to write that someone else needs to hear, but also choosing that over what is my public status? What are my financial accomplishments? What are my other physical markers or external markers of success and recognition? They're limited because they pale in comparison to the recognition I'm able to give myself. These other creators are giving to their works, and we can continue to do as this spirit of saying, hey, I see your great creation. I'm going to keep creating too. You're going to keep creating too. And look, we're going to keep creating, and this world will be better, richer, and more aware of what we learned and what we want them to hopefully know too. That I think would be my biggest takeaways from podcasting. I know it's not just one thing, but I hope it's within a spirit of a thing.
That's beautiful. That's a perfect way to sort of wrap this conversation up. It's been a delight speaking with you, Seth. But is there any final words that you want to say? We've spoken about we've kind of touched upon a lot of the things that you've been working on. Again, links will be in the description for everything, including some things we hadn't spoken about, Major League Magic. You did mention earlier, this is the Language of Fists, which I will be reading. But is there anything else either that you want to promote, anything else that you want to mention, or just a final statement? The floor is yours for the final things before we wrap this up fully.
I think I would say I loved having this conversation. I loved all the things we got to talk about. And it's one of my favorite things about writing. And it's also one of my favorite things about going to events. Last year was my first time going out to Meadowlark and a few other Comic Cons, and then a few more ended up being added on. So I'm making similar forays out into the public. I'll be at a free comic book day event at King Kong Comics in Dublin. And then I'll be in Carson City the following day up in Nevada with my friend Stephen Yu. We'll be working at another comic themed event. And then I've got a few ventures. I'm returning to Meadowlark with Tanya Todd. We will be up there in July. I'm looking at an event in Reno called the Silver Age, and a few others that I'm hoping to have more concrete details on. But the great thing that I love about those is that you get to hear from people directly if they've experienced any of your work before, or if not, or if they want to know more about it, you can tell them the story. And then there's people that you get to meet who are like, hey, I met you somewhere else and now I'm seeing you again. And I read something you did and I get to talk with you about it. I get to tell you what I like and didn't like. I get to ask you questions. And that's a conversation that I almost feel is a wonderful thing that nurtures these ideas that we're all talking about. And much like I'm trying to do a storytelling set that you're doing here with Genuine Chit-Chat, which is to give these creators a voice to keep talking about their art. It's also these conversations that are building and sustaining this sort of fertile artistic ground we all want to cultivate in. And with that in mind, when you see art that you love that art. Tell the people you know about it, that people that are important to you about why something is valuable to you, why it speaks to you. If you can find that creator and tell them about it, please tell them. They so often can imagine that they are in the darkness, sort of shouting into a void, that no one hears them. They're invisible, right? The moment you show them that they're not, the moment you say, hey, this is what spoke to me and why, not only are you giving them that connection, you're answering, you're giving them that response, but what that can trigger, the echoes, the resonance from that. I mean, you might not just save someone's writing from stalling out and never continuing. You might be part of the catalyst that turns it into its next great thing. That conversation you have with someone could be the start of something amazing. And if you're willing to talk about it that much, you keep it alive for all those who will now have the chance to experience it. So I would say, whether you're writing, whether you're talking about the things that you love that are writing or stories or others, you're participating. You're part of this as much as all the rest, and we need you. And we couldn't be here without you. And I hope, if I'm lucky enough, if you're listening and you've enjoyed what I've said, that I'll get to meet you. We'll get to talk about this, and that's going to be a gift for both of us.
Beautiful. Well, thank you so much. And everyone listening, usual stuff. Don't forget to follow me at Genuine Chit-Chat. But more importantly, support independent creators. Obviously, we all like a lot of stuff from the big two and also Disney, Marvel, that kind of jazz. But really important, support independent creators where you can, starting with Comics Lit. Great place to start if you want to start on your indie journey, whether or not you do or don't read comics, whether or not you do or don't read prose. Comics Lit, it's got you covered. Loads of great stuff there. An incredible essay from Seth, which he spoke about here, but you need to read it to really get it. And loads of the individuals that we've spoken about, Tonya Todd, Eric Lee, Kelly Gaines, well, formerly Kelly Gaines, A.R. Farina, all these individuals, they're in Comics Lit. And there's more volumes coming. There's going to be more creators there. So please, Comics Lit, Anachronistic Comics, and then also check out all the other links in the description to Seth's other stuff. And also, if you want to hear more from Seth, as well as storytelling with Seth, as well as the social media, you can sign up to his newsletter as well to get an update on everything he's up to. So I'll put a link in the description for that. So Seth, thank you so much for making the time to come on the show. I really appreciate it. It's been delightful to finally connect with you, and I'm sure this will be the first of many conversations that we have. And thank you for all the art you're putting out into the world.
Thank you, Mike. This was a delight, and really, you started us off on a really fun and interesting direction at the beginning, and I can see the result of that now as we bring this one to a close. It's been a pleasure and a treat. I'm looking forward to the next conversation with you.